The Kalb Report is funded by a grant from the Ethics and Excellence in Journalism Foundation. From the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., this is the Kalb Report with Marvin Kalb.
Hello, and welcome to the National Press Club and to another edition of the Kalb Report. I'm Marvin Kalb, and our program today is called The Fight for Freedom of the Press, Caught in the Crosshairs of Trump's Tweets. In American history, the president and the press have often had a testy, sandpapery kind of relationship. President Nixon, for example, had an enemies list. I remember that list because I was on it. President Obama, for his part, launched more investigations into press leaks than any other president in American history. And yet, there appears to be something special and different about President Trump's attacks on the press. Reporters, he says, are the most dishonest people in the world, the opposition party, indeed the enemy of the American people. Much of their work he labels as fake news, in an effort, it seems, to undermine or even invalidate their work. So one might ask, toward what end? Why? I've invited two of the best young journalists in Washington to help answer these questions. One from cable television news, the other from a newspaper. Jake Tapper joined CNN 4 years ago. He is chief Washington correspondent, and he anchors a weekday interview program called The Lead and the Sunday morning State of the Union show. He was senior White House correspondent for ABC News. He is an author and a cartoonist. David Fahrenthold is a Texan, born and bred, who has been a political reporter for the Washington Post since 2000. His coverage of the 2016 presidential campaign focused first on questionable fundraising practices by the Trump Foundation, which no one else was reporting. And then he broke the story of the 205 Hollywood video showing Trump boasting about his easy way with women. So, gentlemen, welcome, and let's cut to the chase. As I said, it's not news that presidents have had problems with the press going back to George Washington and on, and the press has often had its problems with presidents. But now, with President Trump, are we seeing and experiencing something that could be defined as old wine in new bottles? Or are we really seeing something new and perhaps even disturbing? And let's start with you, Jake.
First of all, it's an honor to be here, and thank you so much for having me on the show. It's great to be here, and I want to say hi to your brother out there also, who, when he was at CNN, was the first person, him and Howard Kurtz, to put me on television. So the credit or blame lies over there. It is not old wine in new bottles. It is something new. As you point out, there have been previous presidents, including President Obama, who used the Espionage Act more than all other presidents combined to go after people who leak to the press, who have behaved problematically with the Fourth Estate. What President Trump is doing, I think, is different, both in scale and in what he's trying to do, what he's trying to accomplish, and goal. He is trying to delegitimize any reports, any reporters who report on him in any way critically and factually. And he is doing that in the same way he is trying to delegitimize the judiciary when they rule against him, the legislative branch when they provide oversight over him. I don't know what the end goal is. I suspect that the end goal is for people to only believe him. There doesn't seem to be a lot of respect for institutions at all. whether it is NATO or the European Union or the United Nations or the free press. Labeling media, labeling the Fourth Estate the enemies of the American people, a term that he has not used to describe Al-Qaeda or ISIS or those in the Russian government who, according to US intelligence agencies, attempted to interfere and succeeded in the 2016 election, says really all you need to know about what he thinks about media that reports upon him critically. So I think it's problematic, but by the same token, our founding fathers were brilliant, and we still have this land where David can write what he writes, and I can broadcast what I can broadcast, as can you, and the judiciary thrives, and the legislative branch stands and provides oversight. So if it weren't for those pesky founding fathers, maybe he'd get away with it, but.
David, you agree generally?
I agree. I think there's the other thing that's new about this relationship is that I don't think we've ever had a president who relies on the news media so much as Trump does for his own sense of self-worth and as his intelligence services, as his view into the world. You always think of the president as somebody who, when they get in, they'll find out who killed JFK, they'll find out what's in Area 51, they'll know everything. And President Trump seems to learn almost everything that he acts on from television, or from reading the newspaper. So there is this relationship where, as Jake said, he's tried to delegitimize us when we write things critically about him, but nobody in America consumes more of the news media than President Trump does, and he often sees us as sort of the main, sort of as a huge part of how he governs. I mean, just the story about how he decided to launch the Tomahawk missile strikes on Syria was not that he'd read something in an intelligence report that changed his mind. He watched CNN and he saw these images from Khan Sheikhoun where this particular attack of many attacks in Syria came home to him because he saw it on television. So as he's tried to delegitimize us, he's also made us so much a part of how he explains his decisions and how he acts. It's a very strange dichotomy.
Okay, well then, how do you like yourself personally being a fake news reporter?
I have to say, although there have been these attacks on us as fake news and enemies of the people, in other ways, I feel like we are at a moment of unusual power in the news media in Washington. I feel like because of the way President Trump relies on us to make decisions, but also because of the disorganization and the sort of lack of control of his White House, the people who would normally be sort of shaping a story don't. And often so people then rely more on us to make sense of what's happened. And also, often people even in the White House, in power, need us to tell them what just happened to them, right? Think of the example of how did Mike Pence learn that the National Security Advisor, Mike Flynn, had lied to him about his contacts with the Russian ambassador? He read about it in the Washington Post. So I do feel like there have been these attacks on us, but we're at a time when I think our influence is greater than it has been, simply because of the people who try to shape the message are so disorganized.
And yet, pick it up.
Well, I was just going to
Jake.
say.
No, let me follow up
Sorry.
here.
I'm used to anchoring.
33% of the American people, according to a most recent Gallup poll, 33% agree that you guys are pretty good, that you do a good job. But that means 2 out of 3 Americans don't. So what's going on here? Have you guys failed to communicate in some way to most Americans? Are most Americans tuned out when it comes to people like you and tuned into another way of getting news? What's going on here?
There are a lot of complicated things going on. One of them is I tend to think of polls about the media in the same way I think of polls about Congress. People hate Congress, but they keep reelecting their congressmen. 90-95% reelection levels. And I think people hate the media, but they like their sources of information. I mean, our ratings are great, and I know a lot of other news organizations are thriving, the Washington Post, the New York Times, subscriptions are picking up, et cetera. I also think that some of the problems that the media has have been self-inflicted wounds. Going back to Janet Cook at the Washington Post or faulty reports at CNN, et cetera. Through the years, there have been problems in the media. And I do think that the proliferation of media has made it easier for people on the left and the right to only seek out sources of information that reaffirm their views and don't challenge them to think, which tends to discount critical thinking and also undermine people who are trying to provide impartial reporting that doesn't side with any ideology.
Right. David, what specific problems can you isolate and define for us that you have in covering the Trump administration?
Well, the main problem for me, and this goes back to the Trump campaign, I think it continues to the Trump administration, is that we had sort of come to rely on the idea that if you were going to write something about a candidate or about an administration that they would view as critical, they would view as negative for them, that the response would be overwhelming from them. You'd get calls from 15 people, you get yelled at by somebody off the record, then you get somebody calling you on background, or sending you white papers, sending you all this information, that their reaction would be to tell their story forcefully. And try to either convince you it's not a story, or to convince you that the world looks more like their perspective than you thought. The Trump reaction has often been no reaction. That was my experience during the campaign, especially when I would call them to ask about the Trump Foundation or the other things that I'd found. The reaction was just not to respond to me at all. And that's hard. That's I think they were hoping to sort of starve the story of oxygen. That they don't participate, maybe you can't write the story. And I think Trump was used to that because so much of his background, his business dealings were sort of private. I think he was used to the idea that you needed him to tell you what he did, or else you couldn't write the story. That was the hardest part for me last year, was trying to get other sources who could corroborate what Donald Trump had done.
What about now?
Right now, I think the bigger problem, there's the lack of reaction from the official sources, and also a willingness of people within the White House to speak on background or on the record untruthfully and to disagree with each other, right? The idea previously being, I think TV will definitely notice this, if someone from the White House was going to come on television and speak under their own name about what the White House had done or what the White House was about to do, you could be sure that that was part of some larger strategy and that you could rely on them speaking on the record about what was going to happen. Mm-hmm. And we've seen so many examples where they put people out on television. Kellyanne Conway is a great example, but there are others, where they'll say something that's not true, or they'll make a prediction about something that is false. For instance, the Mike Flynn situation. Mike Flynn is the president's confidence. He's 100% of the backing of the president. 5 hours later, he's fired by the president. Mike Flynn never lied to Mike Pence, and 5 hours later, we learned that he did. The idea that you could bring people on, and when they spoke on the record, they would be speaking in a way that was reliable, we based a lot of things on that. It's hard to adjust when that's not true.
Jake, how do you cover a president who does not always tell you the truth?
By telling the viewers the truth.
How do you do that? How do you manage that?
Well,
do you use the word lie?
You can use the word lie if something has been so proven. Obviously, the word lie means an intention to deceive, an intention to share something that is information that is false, that they know it's false. So it gets into
Motivation.
When motive is clear, such as the lie that President Obama wasn't born in the United States, or that Hillary Clinton started it and Donald Trump ended it, those are lies. Those are not true. They're provably, demonstrably false.
Can you then call the president a liar?
I have found it more beneficial to focus on actions than character. I think it is better for us to cover the things that are said and say whether or not these things are true or not true, or decent or not decent. For instance, going after POWs, making fun of the disabled, those are indecent behaviors by any empirical adult standard. I do not find it, I do not choose to label him and assail his character. I choose to focus on the action.
Is there a company policy at CNN and at the Post about the use of the word liar and lie?
No?
No?
I mean, there is the policy that you can't, that's not a decision you make on your own. You have to, if it's going to be done, it's going to be decided at the highest levels.
Now, the New York Times has decided to use words like lie and liar.
But not promiscuously. They use it.
Not at all.
Yeah,
but they do use them.
Sure, and I'd use it too, but I think it's more important to focus on the facts. it's not about me versus Donald Trump. It's about the truth. And if I make it about me versus Donald Trump, then I'm clouding it.
Okay. What about the use of tweets? Now, there's an awful lot of tweets, and if you're doing a good research paper, could we use those as primary source material now?
I think so. Absolutely.
Certainly, yes.
Yeah.
But what I think has been interesting about the tweets and the way that we've covered them is that you remember during the transition, Trump would tweet anything, people would react to it. We'd cover it like crazy, even if it was about Arnold Schwarzenegger or something else. But especially if it was something like Chicago's terrible, I'm going to send in the feds. 3 million people voted illegally, and the assumption was we covered those things because normally when a president speaks, the president is speaking about something he intends to take action on, right? The idea was, well, if Trump is going to tweet that he is going to send the feds into Chicago, he must be about to send the feds into Chicago. But then we see him as president, and we see so often that what he tweets about is just something that has gone by on television, he's angry about, and then he's going to forget about it. He's not going to do the thing that he's implied by tweeting about it. And I think he's really diluted the power of that weapon by seeming to imply that he was going to take presidential action that he never follows up on. So I think they're covered much differently now than they were.
We're dealing with how you cover somebody like President Trump. During the Watergate scandal, the old mafia line was follow the money. In following the story of this president, what is it that you're following? What's drawing you toward the next story?
Well, there are any number of trails to follow. Obviously, the investigation into what happened last year with the Russians. But that's several different trails as well. There is the collusion that the FBI is investigating as to whether or not it happened, or whether or not there was any sort of coordination. There is the money, following the money. What financial relationships has President Trump, then citizen Trump, had with Russians, with people who had ties to Putin? And those trails continue. There is the story of his vast business empire. And we have, on my show, a thing called Conflict of Interest Watch. Wherever there is a potential conflict, we look into that. And so that's just ongoing. Those 3 trails are ongoing every day, no matter what. Now we have the Trump presidency. I find those tweets wonderful primary source material, and never have I enjoyed them more than this week, when he completely went against everything he was saying to then President Obama in 2013. And it's all there. To his credit, he hasn't deleted them. But every single thing about the Syria strike, he contradicted, whether it's congressional approval or taking the strike at all. I mean, every single thing about it, he was different. He had the exact opposite position in 2013. And so it's been a remarkable turn of events, and people don't have to rely upon just my discussion or my characterization of his position. Throw up the tweets, they're right there. This is what he said, he's doing the exact opposite.
David, let me ask you this. Good reporters, and you're one of them, operates partly on fact, partly on instinct. You sort of have a feel. Do you have a feel for what is the big story now that is just lurking over the near horizon? What might it be?
Yeah, let me know.
Well, the thing that I think is interesting is what's going to happen with Congress. Trump has promised that he's going to create this sort of Republican revolution. He has 2 Republican houses of Congress. But he also he's not a strategic thinker. He's somebody who thinks about today and who wronged him today. And so in order to make things happen in Congress, maybe you need to remember who wronged you today, but you need to work with them tomorrow. And so he's moved so fast from trying to work with the right wing, to hating the right wing, to making them an offers they couldn't refuse, and then they refused it, and now what's he going to do? And now he's already talking about working with Democrats. So how he works with Congress and what he chooses to do with them, he's taking on these really complicated issues like tax reform, building the wall, even funding the government, at the same time as he's focused on who made him mad today in Congress. I'm really going to be fascinated to see what happens.
Jake, I think we all know that there's a lot of speculation these days about the president. He dominates the news. in a way I think that no other president has. I could be dead wrong on that. But people want to know so much more about him. Do you feel every now and then in that uncomfortable position of being more a psychiatrist than a reporter?
It is interesting that a successful real estate developer is now living rent-free in all of our heads. So I'm not sure he's the only one that should be psychoanalyzed. I'm referring to myself, starting with me, but he has certainly taken on an oversized role in the preoccupation of the American people, some for good, some for ill. I find in terms of psychoanalyzing him, I always find that dangerous because I am not a licensed psychoanalyst, and those who are bound by their duty to not analyze individuals whom they have not met. And yet, dozens of psychoanalysts wrote a letter to the New York Times saying that the president was a narcissist. And then the person that wrote the clinical definition of narcissism wrote a letter to the New York Times saying, this is a disorder and I'm actually the world expert on it, and don't let the president off the hook by ascribing to him this disorder. He's an adult. I don't think he has this, and let's hold him responsible. The motivation is important, but I try to stay away from that in my life just because it seems clear. Some things are very obvious, that he does react well to flattery and he reacts poorly to criticism. Why that is, and Fred Trump and all his other family history.
Everybody likes flattery and doesn't like criticism. So
but not to this
what's
extent,
different?
I think it's fair to say. I mean, because most people do not lash out the way that he does.
See, the question that comes up, this is to both of you, is that we live at a time now when lots of people have conversations, not just at the dinner table, but in think tanks everywhere, that there's something going on with democracy itself, that there's a populism afoot, and it's in Europe, it's in the United States, it's right-wing, it's ultra-nationalistic. It looks towards some kind of highly controlled society. The U.S. is part of that discussion. So as we examine the most important politician in the land, do we also think about that larger problem, or is it none of your business as reporters to delve into sort of history projected forward? It's not my line of work. What is your feeling about that? David?
I mean, I think this administration has invited that comparison, the way Bannon has talked about his vision, his role. You know, it's not just about, for him, what's going on in the United States today. It's about creating a new world order in which there's not multinational alliances. Everybody sort of, sits on their own and, makes relationships with other countries without binding together, ignoring the fact that that's basically what started World War I and World War II and many other wars before that. Doesn't have a great track record. So I think they have invited that comparison, and they certainly did during the campaign and during the transition. What's been interesting to me is how little of that has been translated into policy and how little of it appears to be taking hold in Congress. The dynamics we're seeing in Congress, and especially the people who seem to hold the leverage in Congress, the House Freedom Caucus, are not, Steve Bannon-style populists. They're they're libertarian, small government, fiscal conservative types. And those seem to be of the kind that we know from the Tea Party. So that seems to be the ideology that is sort of driving most of the discussion in Congress, and Trump hasn't been able to build any larger movement to pressure those people toward his goals.
I think that it is not only part of the story, I think in a lot of ways it is the story, because Putin's objective has nothing to do with Syria. Putin's objective has nothing to do with Pennsylvania or Michigan or Wisconsin. Putin's objective is the dissolution of NATO and the European Union. That's what he wants, because he wants to bring Russia back to the days of the Soviet Union. And that's the prize for Putin. Everything else is just noise. So nationalism. I one time was speaking to a U.S. general, retired, who said that he wasn't sure that Putin's involvement in Syria wasn't intentionally to create a migration crisis in Europe that would then upend the open borders and globalization. So I think this is a huge part of the story. And one of the things I've constantly said about Trump and his election is, first of all, it is a reaction to globalization, whether you blame it on NAFTA or most favored nation trade policy with China, or you blame it on automation and container ships. Whatever it has had an effect, and we're seeing this as a natural, I think, response to globalization. President Trump's main promises to the American people, I think, were Washington's broken, and I'm going to clean it up. Washington is not protecting your jobs, and I'm going to fix that. Washington is not protecting your borders, and I'm going to fix that. Washington is not protecting you from terrorists, and I'm going to fix that. All four of those are understandable and perfectly legitimate and debatable policy positions. It's all the other stuff that's wrapped around it, I think, that has been problematic.
I want to take a minute now just to alert our radio, television, and web outlets that this is the Kalb Report. I'm Marvin Kalb, and I'm talking about the bumpy press-president relationship with David Farenthold of the Washington Post and Jake Tapper of CNN. As we open the second half of this discussion, I want to ask a question submitted by Anna Whitney, who's a student at the Gaylord College of Journalism at the University of Oklahoma. And she asks in an interesting way, has the Trump presidency awakened a golden age of journalism? You guys touched on it earlier. That's a beautifully optimistic question, and I love it. I really love it. But how would that golden age be manifest? And what would you guys have to do about finding a new budget that worked for most news organizations, the training of reporters, the dealing of this rise of populism, all of that? David, give us a sense of the golden age.
I think it is way too early to know if it's a golden age. As I said, I think we have a lot of our audience has grown enormously. There's a huge number of people who I think tuned into Washington politics in the last month of an election and then normally tuned out, assuming that it would go back to be sort of boring speechifying in the Senate. And now they're really encouraged or they're terrified, and they're watching, the House Intelligence Committee's actions day to day, these appeals court decisions in Hawaii, Maryland. They're so interested in the things that Jake and I both cover. That's great to have that interest, and it's not the end of our business problems, but it's certainly better than not having a big interested audience. And I think that we've also seen some incredible work being done on Washington, from voices inside the White House, investigative journalism. That's all great, but I think there's two things that I worry about. One is the business model for journalism outside Washington and New York. If you're going to have a golden age of journalism, you're going to need people holding state houses accountable and mayors accountable. And even if you're going to try to understand what's happening in Washington, you need people back in home states watching their congressmen. And if we don't build a business model that provides that, I don't think you could really see it as a golden age. Also, one of the things that happened over the last 15 years in Washington was a greater availability of data about government to the public and the media, through raw data being put out online, through responses to FOIAs. And that stuff is largely still out there, thankfully. There's a lot of things you can learn now about what the government spends money on that you couldn't have accessed that easily 10 years ago. And if that remains out there, and if the Trump administration honors those commitments to open government, I think will be a great age for Washington journalism. If they cut it off, it's going to be a lot harder.
I think that it's potentially a great age for American journalism. I agree with everything David said about local journalism, which still concerns me a great deal as well. I do think that there have been a lot of great examples of exemplary journalism in the last 15, 20 years. But I think that the adversarial relationship that we see with this administration right now is the standard for us to have going forward for the next president and the president after and the president after. Even if they're not calling us fake news and making wild, outlandish claims, we need to remember that these people are not our friends. These people are public officials that we're supposed to hold accountable. A lot of the same people who praise me now didn't particularly care for my attitude towards President Obama and his administration. So it's unusual for me to be heralded by people wearing knit pink caps. Because a few years ago they were calling me a right-winger and cursing me when I tried to do the same thing to President Obama and his team.
And yet, over and over again, there is increasing evidence that the American people are fascinated by this personality who is our president. And they seem to want to have more and more about him. And I'm curious about your view. Is that because the American people are interested simply in more entertainment? That politics has become another form of entertainment, which in my judgment has cheapened the process? Or do they really want more information about our politics and the way that we govern ourselves? What would you think, David?
I think that what's happening with Trump, there's two factors. One is that he does change his positions on a lot of things at a speed that is remarkable even for a politician. Think of all the things that he's changed his mind on since taking office. Think of all the things he's changed his mind on since breakfast. Right, exactly right. Right. So that's one thing. So rather than watching the administration, rather than watching the White House and sort of the slow grinding of wheels toward a purpose that you understand, it's a wind-up car. It's going every which way. So watching him is the only way to know what's happening. Also, he is somebody who, more than a lot of things, is a reality television star. And what's the way you entertain people through that? It's relationships. Who, on the real world set, who's dating who's mad at who. And so much of the coverage of the White House, I think invited by him, is who's my friend today? Is it Jared? Is it Bannon? Is it Priebus? Who's out? Who's in?
Does he want that?
Yes, I think he wants it. I think he understands that it's entertainment. And with him, it matters a lot more. That, no one would care about which one of President Obama's advisors was in or out because probably they all urged sort of the same thing. But the difference between Priebus being close to him or Bannon or Jared Kushner could be enormous in terms of policy. So we cover it as well. I think it's not only entertaining because it's so simple to understand, but it's actually quite important.
It's quite consequential. I mean, Jared Kushner won the debate over Syria over Steve Bannon. I mean, that's how consequential it is.
How do we know that?
Because people in the White House talk. People in the White House leak. And like David says, it's a feature. It's not a bug. The president has surrounded himself. He did this when he was a real estate developer. He would surround himself with people who competed with each other. And he would play them off each other. And
the purpose being what?
The purpose being, I can't speculate. Now you're asking me to be a psychiatrist again. But he clearly thrives on this culture. He thrives on chaos. And I think we all feel it, the chaos. And I think for a lot of Americans, it's great. And for a lot of Americans, it's the source of tremendous anxiety.
Let me talk for a bit about the Russia problem, the issue. And if I could sort of simplify the larger problem, it's that Donald Trump or his associates, wittingly or not, colluded with the Russians to beat Hillary Clinton. Now, from your reporting, is there any evidence that you know to back up that hypothesis? David?
Well, it hasn't been my reporting, but in this case, from my colleagues' reporting, no. There's not that is conclusive, that we'll never find that sort of evidence, but I don't think that we have uncovered anything that shows what you're describing, Trump or his associates directly colluding with the Russians in an effort to help them win the election. There's obviously been signs that might have happened, but there's nothing certain yet, and maybe will never be found.
I think one of the things, I agree, we have not proven anything. We know of no proof of any of this. And it's important for all media reports to present that fact along with anything else that might be circumstantial. One thing that I think is interesting that was raised at the Senate Intelligence Committee hearing on the subject by the Vice Chair, Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, was he noted that there had been information, fake news, actual fake news, lies on spurious websites that made their way to your grandparents' Facebook feeds. Is that Mark Warner pointed out that there were reports that some of these disinformation campaigns seemed to be targeted at the precinct level in states such as Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin, where there was this explosion of support for Donald Trump in the last couple weeks of the campaign. And the question that Senator Warner raised was, do the Russians know enough about American politics to do that on their own, or would somebody in the United States have had to tell them what precincts or what areas to target? That, I think, is where, I don't know if we'll ever get answers to those questions, but that to me seemed a very key question that Senator Warner was raising.
There's an interesting question here about the degree of coverage on an issue for which there appears to be, at this point, nothing that you can nail down as a big bulletin. Sean Spicer, the president's spokesman, said the other day, in a rather humorous way, I thought, that if the president had Russian dressing on his salad at night, you guys would lead your show with that.
If Donald Trump had a salad, I would lead my show with
And the question is,
sorry.
The president loves the word fair, and he accuses the press of being unfair. So think for a second. Have you guys been unfair in the emphasis that you have placed on the Russia story, short of that conclusive bit of evidence that you need?
I think that there has been a lot of hyperbole and hyperventilating from some in the media, and I think it's been very unhealthy and unhelpful. I'm a collegial sort, so I'm not going to name names, in the immortal words of Senator McCarthy, but I do see people on Twitter and people on television writing checks that I'm not sure the evidence is ever going to cash. And it bothers me. And one of the things that I think is important in this era of journalism is that we rise to the moment. And I know from watching and following David, and he's been on my show a few times, that he behaves accordingly. He makes sure that he sticks to the facts. And I am troubled when I see journalists not doing that, because I think it undermines us all.
Yeah, I feel like at the Post, at least, it's certainly a fair question to ask. It's a fair subject to report on. I have, the little bit that I've been involved in the Russia story, and I'm sure Drake knows this too, there's no harder story to report. Everybody involved in it is either a great spy or a liar or a great lying spy. And so much of the reporting, it needs to go on for so long because the sources are so unconventional and you're dealing with a purposeful disinformation campaign on the Russian side. So I think it's perfectly fair to dive into it, not knowing where you're going to get. And I don't think it's unusual to think that we're this many months into it and we don't have solid proof or solid disproof yet. Yeah. That said, I think there is a sense that there's a lot of folks out there who are hoping that, that want to jump straight from the smoke to, the fire, and we don't know necessarily at all what's underneath it all.
Have you guys been threatened, either personally or professionally, by the reporting that you've done on the Trump campaign and the Trump administration?
By people on Twitter, by the administration, there is a lot of nasty invective out there, and that
you get a lot of that?
Yeah, but that didn't start. On January 20th. That was going on before, and I think a lot of journalists, without getting into anything specific about me, let me just say that I think there are a lot of journalists who are using encryption more when it comes to their communications, who are taking more precautions when it comes to their own personal safety, just because it is a time that is fraught with a lot of emotion and a lot of anger.
Based on specific attacks or threats against a particular journalist?
Sure.
Yeah,
and there is this whole underworld of crazy out there. We saw it with Pizzagate. Pizzagate, which is a number of people, and I don't know where the story came from. I don't know if it's part of a Russian disinformation campaign or if it's just a couple crackpots. I have no idea. But this accusation that this neighborhood pizza parlor in Washington had anything to do with pedophilia or Satanism or underground prisons, and it was part of the theory was actually tweeted out by Mike Flynn when he was on the campus.
Son.
I'm talking about the dad. The son did it. The son did it too, specific to the pizzeria. But the father put out one of these crazy tweets about Anthony Weiner's computer uncovered all this evidence of all this nonsense. And that was Mike Flynn, who was later named the national security advisor of the country. So there's a lot of crazy out there. And thank heaven that when the man with the gun showed up at Comet, nothing more serious happened than that. But you have people in power, including Mike Flynn and then his son, putting this nonsense out there. It is a dangerous time for everyone.
It's more the person on television than it is the reporter for a newspaper, isn't that right? Or do you get the same kind of?
We had one particular instance last year where I got a death threat over the phone. Actually, the guy left it on somebody else's voicemail at the Post. It was not a very competently executed death threat. And we did take a lot of security precautions with me personally at my house, and I had taken a lot of precautions online. I have to say, the abuse that the actual sort of official abuse, did the Trump campaign, does the Trump administration come after you, yell at you? I get none of that. I got none of that during the campaign. I got non-responses, but I never got the kind of angry responses, even that you got from people in the Obama administration. And Trump fans, supporters, the vitriol and invective that I got from them online on Twitter was actually much less than I got from the 2 times I wrote about Bernie Sanders back in 2015. Bernie Sanders' people were much angrier, much faster than Trump's people were.
Interesting. Let's talk for a little bit about facts. And a presidential surrogate said remarkably several months ago that there is no longer a fact. She said there are no longer anything like facts. And she said that the American people now are smart enough to know on their own what is a fact and what is not a fact. And we remember, I'm sure, the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan sharply disagreeing with that idea. Everyone is entitled to his own opinion, he said, but not his own facts. And yet here we are in a kind of post-fact world. And first, what do you think that means for our politics and our journalism as you guys cover politics?
I don't think we live in a post-fact world. I think the president would like us to live in that world, but I reject the notion that we're there. And I will fight it as long as I can, because this is part of the delegitimization plan, is if no facts are correct, then President Trump can say and do whatever he wants. And I don't know that there's that much strategy that goes into it, but obviously he's not particularly tethered to fact when it comes to his own pronouncements, whether it is Obama wiretapped me at Trump Tower, or 3 to 5 million illegal votes were cast for Hillary Clinton, or vaccines cause autism, or Ted Cruz's dad was involved in the assassination of Kennedy, or go on and on and on. And this is also one of the reasons why I think it's so important that media rise to the moment. When we mess up, we undermine ourselves, and we undermine all of our brothers and sisters in journalism. Mm-hmm. So, but this is one of the most important fights that we're waging right now, is to stand up for what is true and what is accurate. And when Donald Trump says that the murder rate is the highest it's been in 47 years, that's not true. It's just not true. Now, is it a lie? I don't think it's a lie, because I think he actually thought that the murder rate was higher than it was in 47 years, because he didn't understand the chart that somebody had given him, which is that it had gone up more from 2015 to 16 than it had in the previous 47 years, but it's still in record lows. But we need to be precise, and we need to explain this to the people. It's one of the most important services that we currently provide.
Well, what then is the danger? Explain it to me. I've just arrived from Mars, and I want to be introduced to this America that I see before me. And so if the President of the United States wants to live in a post-fact world, what's the danger there? So what?
Well, the danger is that he is now launching military campaigns based on facts that he is asserting, such as Assad was behind a chemical weapons attack, or Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was housed in this building in Yemen. And let me just say also, I'm not doubting the assertions that he is making or that military intelligence told him those assertions. But the point is, now the stakes are where he is taking actions where people are being killed based on facts that he is asserting. So it's important for him to be seen as somebody who is credible, not just for himself, but for our entire country.
David,
And the world, and for the world.
Absolutely. David, there's a feeling that if you keep on living in an environment that either by presidential direction or inclination is post-fact, whatever that truly means, we end up thinking that a lot of what 20 years ago or 30 years ago or even 10, we would take as normal for our politics, our journalism, our lives, is now sort of abnormal, but we accept it because it happens over a period of time.
Right.
The abnormality appears to shrink, and we accept what genuinely is a bit nutty and dangerous as normal.
Right.
Does that strike you as right and a cause for rather considerable concern?
Certainly. I mean, I think that we saw that a lot during the campaign. Things that would have been seen as abnormal or outside the realm of acceptable behavior by a president were countenanced, and we've seen it already. We saw it in the first days of the Trump administration when Sean Spicer came out and told us the absolute falsehood that this was the biggest inaugural crowd that we'd ever seen. So,
does he immediately, by the way, excuse me for interrupting, by saying something like that right out of the box, so to speak, does he then lose, as a spokesman has one thing more than anything else, that's his credibility. And if you lose that on the first day,
absolutely, he lost it. And then Kellyanne Conway, by coming out and saying that he had an alternative fact, she lost it as well. And I'm not saying that she lost it with me or she lost it with the Washington media. She lost it with the public, right? The public sees that. They're not, that. I think those were things that they chose to do in the first couple of days to make this rather unimportant assertion about the size of the inaugural crowd that right off the bat took them from a position of great power and influence with the public and really diminished that. I think they had so much power to shape the public in the way they wanted right off the bat, and by doing that, they sort of hurt themselves for really no purpose at all. So I think the idea that they do these things and get away with them. During the campaign, there was always another side. Campaigns are always times when people are more willing to believe what their tribe believes. I think now that we're actually in the period of governing, there's no Hillary Clinton out there as a foil. I think those things do hurt their credibility, rather than warping the public to believe that that's normal now.
And Jake, you and Kellyanne Conway are quite a duo. I mean, you do your thing quite often. And was it just once that you would not put her on the show?
There was once that we wouldn't put her on the show, but that had less to do, in my mind, with Kellyanne Conway than it did to do with the fact that she was being offered to us as a consolation prize because Vice President Pence was doing every other Sunday show except for ours.
Oh, I see.
And so Kellyanne Conway, and she had credibility issues at CNN, but my reason for not taking her that Sunday was, if Vice President Pence wants to boycott me, I want that to be the message from the White House. Kellyanne came on my show, my weekday show, 2 days later, and that's the one that you remember, the 25-minute interview we had about the nature of fact and truth. But and the reason, I should just point out, the reason that Vice President Pence was boycotting my show was because I had him on in December, right as this Pizzagate craziness was going on. And I had found out and reported that the Trump transition team had actually put in for a security clearance for Mike Flynn Jr., who, after the guy with the gun went into the pizza parlor, was still out there tweeting about how this was a real cover-up of this horrible, insane, fantastical conspiracy theory. And in fact, so I was trying to press Vice President Pence, did you know, you're in charge of the transition team, did you know that the transition team put in for a security clearance for him? And he wouldn't answer the question, and I very politely persisted in trying to get him to answer the question. And when you do that, you run the risk of, this person will never come on your show again, And that's what happened.
You've raised an interesting question here about the role of the White House in determining the people who show up on these Sunday interview programs. And I remember when I did Meet the Press, and that's in the mid-1980s. At that time, they had great influence because they could dangle a vice president or secretary of state in front of you. But I have the impression now that it's much more organized than perhaps it was then. For example, Pence would appear on 4 or 5 programs on the same morning.
Right.
Why don't you say, no, I don't want him? You apparently
Well, they didn't even
did
offer him,
with
so
Kellyanne.
they
They
didn't offer him to me.
No, but if he had, you'd have taken him even as the 5th show that day, dealing with Pence. Why do you do that? Why not go in a different direction? Why follow the lead in a sense?
Well, we have gone in a different direction. The White House spent a few weeks boycotting State of the Union, but then they started offering people, and they frankly were people that, I don't want to embarrass them, but they were people that we didn't think were worth putting on air for the issues we wanted to discuss. It just depends on the news cycle. We're going to have Ambassador Nikki Haley on State of the Union tomorrow. I'm not sure if she's going to be on other channels or not, but I think after the Syria strike, she's definitely a guest worth having. So I agree with you that there should be Sunday shows and other shows should not feel compelled to take an administration guest. But I think
if you don't, will they not provide a major guest for you a month from now when you want them?
I don't know. Certainly and you know this from Meet the Press, certainly the whole question of getting guests is a complicated one
It is a big deal.
for booking. But I have to say, I think I fault more on the side of being able to look my kids in the face, being able to tell my viewers what's going on, than I am on the side of being able to book guests. And I think that has actually hurt my ability to book guests.
Yeah, fair enough. David, the Trump administration is fascinating in so many different ways, but one of them has to do with the use, the presence, the involvement of his immediate family. Mm-hmm. Does your gut tell you that we are in the process, the American people, of building a dynasty of Trumps?
Meaning that they would succeed him in office as president?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. None of them have had the career that Donald Trump has had. None of them, including Ivanka, I would say, have shown the kind of entrepreneurial salesmanship that Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump, for whatever else you want to say about him, is an amazing salesman, and he has been forever, and he made himself into that, right? Fred Trump wasn't that, and he is. And none of the rest of them seem to have that kind of ambition or skill at sort of broad-scale salesmanship. Donald Trump Jr. has said this week he might run for governor of New York. So maybe I'll be proven wrong, but I don't see that in the next administration, that they're grooming themselves to be elected office. It's hard to pass that skill down. We've seen so many times when people who are the children or the spouses of very great politicians, just even though they're around it all the time, they can't pick it up. And I don't see that happening in the Trump family.
Jake, do you think that the Trump war on the press, that's his word, not mine, is going to affect the future of journalism?
Yes, but for the better.
Please tell me about it.
Because I think that young people are inspired to go into journalism more today than they were even 1 or 2 years ago.
Really?
That's anecdotal, but that's what it feels like. I mean, I hear from friends of mine who are teachers or college professors who talk about how students are talking about becoming journalists. They see it in the same way that I'm sure you saw it when Ed Murrow called you up in 1957, or in a lot of ways that the generation that was inspired by Woodward and Bernstein
Absolutely.
Decided to go into journalism. They saw it as a noble profession. They saw it as a calling. And I'm not saying that anybody I know is Edward Murrow or Bob Woodward or Carl Bernstein, except of course for Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. But I do think that anecdotally, I'm hearing that people out there are inspired to do so, and that makes me really delighted.
David, how, in just a couple of seconds here, how do you get the American people to buy into the idea that journalists represent an honorable, good, decent, important profession.
I think they're doing that. I think
they
people are tuning into us, watching us, paying attention to us in a way they haven't before. The test will be if when Donald Trump eventually is no longer president and somebody else is president that they may agree with, do they stick with us, right? Or are they only doing this because they hate Donald Trump so much and they think we're a way to get him, that they're following us? If they follow us when we're after the next president, if that president's a Democrat.
So you don't buy the polls that say that most Americans aren't really that in love with you.
They're not talking about Jake and I.
No, no.
Fake polls.
I think we've come to the end of the line, and our time is up. And I want to first thank our audience here at the National Press Club and around the world, and most especially, I want to thank Jake Tapper of CNN and David Farenthold of the Washington Post for sharing their insights, perspectives. We really do appreciate it, and in my judgment, you both represent the best in American journalism. I want now to conclude with this thought. One day, Donald Trump will be gone, his days in office over. But the United States of America will still be standing as tall as a free nation should. And I think the free press will be there too. And the free press is an essential pillar in our democracy. It's written into the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and it's as valid, as vital today as it was then and will be tomorrow and the day after. And a free press, if supported by the public, can still perform miracles for this country and countries around the world. And I think it does so every day, Trump or no Trump. And that's it for now. I'm Marvin Kalb, and as Ed Murrow used to say many years ago, good night and good luck. Thank you, guys. Okay. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have about 20 minutes now for questions and answers. Questions from you and answers from them, I hope. And there's a camera over there, and if I can see over there. And please, if you have a question, line up. I'll try to see through the haze, but I don't know. But there you are. Okay, let's start over there. Please identify yourself, ask a question, don't make a speech. If you begin to make a speech, I'm going to cut you off, so don't. Please start.
Thanks, Dave and Jake, for coming. I'm Tom Risen. I'm with Aerospace America. Trump didn't start the press crackdown, but his Justice Department could be even less sympathetic than Obama's to the press. How can we protect the rights of smaller outlets who don't have very deep pockets to defend themselves, like whether they're subpoenaed or sued by someone, or if they're detained at a protest? Like here at the inauguration protests, a group of protesters and reporters were surrounded by police. The larger established reporters were allowed to go from, news TV news and whatnot, and smaller outlets were detained with some of the protesters, like from Vocactive. And not only that, the reporter from Vocactive was discouraged from telling his story. He had to quit his job to tell that story. That's like self-censorship. So even if Donald Trump doesn't do anything to sue reporters, he is emboldening this culture of fear against the press. How do we assert the rights of smaller outlets?
A very good question, and I thank you. David, you want to start?
Well, I mean, that is a question that weighs on me a lot because, people that don't have Jeff Bezos or CNN behind them, it's much more, even if all you're doing is paying your bail, if you're paying a lawyer for a criminal case like that. To me, the answer has to be both a lot of coverage from us, from the big outlets, but also people like the Reporters Committee for the Freedom of the Press, Committee to Protect Journalists, these organizations that are there to protect the legal rights of journalists who don't have a big organization behind them. I think those are great organizations, and I hope that as journalism, parts of the journalism world make more money, those places can get a little bit of that and serve to protect everybody else.
It's really part of the concern behind the questions that I asked you earlier. Because we want to feel that journalism does have brighter days, but to be part of a large organization, you're protected to that extent. But this gentleman's question, I think, is so real because it cuts to all of them without so much money and political power.
Yeah, I think one of the things for people to keep in mind is it's never been easier to reach out to people who have platforms like me or David. It's never been easier to reach us on social media, on email, on phone even. I remember, I know that I have like 1 million followers on Twitter, and I know that if I tweet something about a story, it will get attention from people, whether it's about a controversial person saying something heinous and who's about to speak at a major political conference, or something else. Those arrests, I know I tweeted a few stories about those arrests. Reaching out to people like us who can make sure that it's covered or even just tweeted about is always helpful. And I know David and I are always out there, and there are lots of us in the media, with big outlets who are trying to help and look out for people in smaller outlets, and just keep us informed as much as you can, and we'll try to have our eyes open.
Please.
Hi, I'm Andrew Craig. I'm an investigative reporter and author here in Washington. My question is for Mr. Tapper, who I'd like to thank for such a great discussion overall. Since last spring, I've had a puzzling question for you that arises out of an investigative story that a member of the press club here broke last April. He's drew on his military experience and experience on virtually every cable network and news network to break a story that strongly suggested that Rafael Cruz was the mystery man standing next to Lee Harvey Oswald, August 16th in 1963. That story was picked up by the National Enquirer, Donald Trump, and instantly, almost, you and your CNN colleagues denounced it and continued to denounce that.
I'd appreciate
And
a
my
question,
question
please.
is, who was standing next to Oswald? Where was Rafael Cruz that summer? And if you don't know, why not admit it instead of repeating continuously that it's a fraudulent story?
Thank you very much. Jake?
You want me to answer that? Okay. Rafael
Do it
Cruz.
briefly, if you can.
Rafael Cruz says it was not him. Rafael Cruz, at that point, had fled Cuba. I believe his sister had been beaten by the Castro government. People, I'm kind of at a loss for words here that you're asserting something that Rafael Cruz and Ted Cruz say is nonsense and there's no truth to it. You're looking at photographs and saying it is him, and you're holding up the National Enquirer as some sort of credible source. So I'm afraid.
Okay, we're not going to get into a debate now. That could be later. Thank you. Next question.
No, it will not be later.
No. I said it could be later. Go ahead.
Hi, I am Ricky. I am a legislative staffer on the Hill. I guess my question is going off of something that David said about people believing the media for what they have to say. Because I remember Allison Camerota on CNN had a segment with a group of people after the election who said they did believe that there were 3 million illegal voters because the Trump campaign said it. So when you continue to do interviews with people from the Trump staff, because for fear of seeming partisan if you do not, why will you continue to do that if people continue to believe the lies that they spew?
Okay.
I think that if they work for the President of the United States and they're speaking on behalf of the President of the United States, it's important to let them, you can't say it, and maybe you can have them talk and then say that what they said was false or there's no evidence for what they said. But I don't think we should hide from the public the idea that people who work for the president will come out on the record and say things that are totally wrong. I think there is something we need to think about in terms of repeating false claims over and over again once they're known to be false. But I think sort of proactively not putting on people that you think might tell a lie, even though those people work for the president of the United States, I don't think that makes any sense.
Okay, good. Yes, please.
Yes, Carl Gollivan. I'm a retired special agent, U.S. Customs. On 9/11, I was with the U.S. Customs Office of Internal Affairs in November of that year. Served 3 weeks between Ground Zero, Fresh Kills Landfill, sifting the rubble of World Trade Center 7. Now, Mr. Tapper, we met on April 18th, 2016 at the Newseum. You were part of a panel with the worldwide head of CNN, Jeff Zucker.
I beg you to ask a question.
This is foundational, sir. I gave you information produced by architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth that I verify. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 undermines the entire official story of 9/11. And I challenged you, I begged you to report this story. Why won't you report the true evidence of false flag terrorism on 9/11 and the collapse of World Trade Center 7?
Okay, thank you. You want to try that?
Nope.
Okay. Next question, please.
Yeah, good morning, and thank you again for coming. My name's Kent. Sorry, I'm a college student about to graduate and enter the Department of Defense, actually. And so my part of my question is, how do you engage with people who may be wanting to tell the truth and may want to reject some of the things that might be coming out of the White House, but who also might have legal barriers from doing that, right? Like, obviously, if someone's coming to you with information, I'd imagine it's pretty easy for you to just take that and repeat it, and you may be even legally protected. But is there some kind of ethical barrier for yourself in which you might not want to do that? Because it seems like the amount of leaks coming from all levels of government, as some of the assuming the more left sides of the government that are still doing their jobs.
Okay.
How do you navigate that?
I think it's important, if I'm understanding your question correctly, I think it's important for reporters to not just grab every leak and assume it's true. We have to vet the claims. We have to seek alternative sources, and I think that's one of the things that has been problematic, especially in the early days of the Trump administration, when there were a lot of draft executive orders floating around, and it wasn't clear what had actually been drafted by the Trump team versus any sort of think tank, and things were just floating around. And that something is leaked is not enough of a reason to go with it. The information has to be vetted, and people in charge and in power need to be asked before publication or before broadcast.
David, do you want to say anything?
Am I touching on what you're?
More or less, basically, just
No, please, we got to move on.
Sorry, that's my fault.
The other part of his question, I think, was about the leakers themselves. How do you protect people who come to you with information? And obviously, we do a lot of things to give people secure ways to transmit things to us electronically. We promise them anonymity. But there always is a discussion of, if you think that there's somebody who may not understand the consequences of leaking what they have, you always have to think about what it's going to mean to this person's life, and to make sure that they understand the risk that they may be taking and understand what will become of the information that they've given away. That's one of the hardest parts of dealing with somebody like that, you're acting in the interest of making sure they're prepared, even if it means maybe that the story can't be as good or it can't go as fast.
Interesting.
Hi, I'm Sandra
Yes,
Abrams.
please.
I'm a member of the press club. Tangential to all of this Trump and the media is what Tillerson is doing over at the State Department, and not having media there and not taking questions from the press. Can you talk to that issue, as well as what impact that's having on reporters, and what can the media outlets do about it? Thank you.
It's been problematic, Secretary of State Tillerson's behavior and attitude towards the media, to say the least. Bringing one select reporter from a right-leaning outlet on his first trip. There was a pool reporter on his next trip that was good, but it was only one. I think there are a lot of people who were hoping for better from Secretary Tillerson, and I think it's something that the United States media is going to have to continue to push him on and pressure him on. He is doing an interview this weekend. I'm not going to tell you what channel because it's not mine, but he is doing an interview this weekend. So maybe it is baby steps towards progress, but it's been problematic. He's I don't know the man, but obviously he came from ExxonMobil as the CEO, in which he was responsible only to shareholders, and he doesn't seem to quite yet get that he works for us, and that the way that you learn about what he's doing is through people like David and myself and you, Marvin. So hopefully he's on the right path, but it is a big problem, I agree.
Do you think he's doing it on his own or told to do it by the White House? What do you hear?
I mean, I know one of the problems he has is that he's been having trouble getting approval from the White House for deputies and other assistants
Yes.
At the State Department. So, I mean, that's a problem for him. It's a problem for Mattis and others. So I don't know. It sounds like Jared Kushner is, meanwhile, taking a lot of his portfolio, traveling to Iraq and elsewhere. So I don't know.
Okay. Next question, please.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, hi, I'm John Park. I'm a student at UCLA. I want to ask a very simple question because you talked about how a lot of the young journalists want to go into journalism. As somebody who's graduating, who's trying to look for a job in journalism, I'm just curious as to how do you make sure that people who go into journalism stay in journalism and do the work that they like to do?
I mean, that's a huge concern for me because so many of the places that so many of us started and the kind of jobs that people start out in are less prevalent now because smaller papers have shrunk. But the things that do give me hope in this regard are the rise of places like the Texas Tribune, ProPublica, nonprofit newsrooms, or new models of newsrooms that cover state and local news. So there are fewer outlets out there, but I think there are still enough outlets for people to go in and stay. So I think that's, as I said, that whole system is the feeder system for places like CNN and the Washington Post, but also it does an enormous amount of good in its own right, state and local news outlets. And so hopefully there's some way that will be preserved as we in the sort of coastal media thrive under Trump.
Good. Thank you. Yes,
Hi, my
next
name's
question.
Jason Pico from Washington, D.C. My question is about sort of balancing who you talk to or who's covered. After the Syria strikes in the Washington Post, there was an article about sort of it really wasn't Assad's regime. It was from sort of the right-wing bloggers. How do you decide how or if they're going to be allowed, if you're going to cover them, and what's your concern about journalism going down the line if they're able to sort of pop up where 10 years ago you would never have heard of these people?
You mean the alt-right bloggers and
Well,
such?
yeah, or it's on either it seems more of them far right now, but far left as well.
This is something that's especially interesting in the Trump era because the Trump White House is elevating a lot of these people who are, whether you want to call them alt-right or alt-reich or whatever, however you want to characterize them, individuals who hold clearly bigoted beliefs and don't seem to have much respect for fact or truth. Elevating them is a problem. It's a problem when Kellyanne Conway and Don Trump Jr. and others in the White House elevate these individuals. It's a problem, I think, when people in the media describe that elevation without accurately conveying who these people are and what they believe. So we're in an era now where there's a great democratization going on of voices. That's a good thing on its face. But it also means that unhinged voices and racist voices and anti-Semitic voices, et cetera, also have the same abilities and rights as anyone else. And I think it's something that the White House needs to be very careful about, and I think it's something that media needs to be very careful about when describing these individuals and elevating them as well. Because somebody, for example, who believes that date rape is impossible, which is one of these individuals, is not somebody who should be mainstreamed. Somebody who is an apologist for rape. So I think great care needs to be taken when journalists describe the influence that these individuals have.
Thank you very much, Jake. We'll take one more question over here, please.
Okay, you can go ahead. I just have a question. I'll hold the mic.
Hello.
Hello, my name is Sherry Howard. I'm a member of the Press Club. I was wondering if, as more traditional journalists, you feel an obligation to, nip these kind of internet conspiracy theories in the bud before they reach a critical mass, as in, the Comet shooter and Pizzagate.
I did that.
I think it's a hard. I think the Pizzagate thing is a great example of something that seemed like it could be ignored because it had no basis in fact, or it could be written about only in the smallest terms possible, because you don't want people to read your story debunking it and then remember the original conspiracy and not the debunking. But that the Pizzagate story, I think, was eye-opening to a lot of us, and that it wasn't just people passing it around on their computers. It's this guy who bought a computer like 4 days before, then got his gun and decided to come investigate himself. So I think that was a eye-opening moment for us in Washington since he came here, and I think we're trying to figure out how to cover these things in a way that we're not just repeating the lie and spreading the lie as we try to debunk it.
That unfortunately puts us out of time, and I'm really sorry about that, and I apologize to the people who are waiting to ask questions and didn't get a chance. So forgive me, bad management of time. But thank you all very much for being with us. And once again, thanks to you, David and Jake. You're both absolutely terrific. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us here today. Thank you for being such a wonderful audience. Please drive safely, and we will see you in the fall.